Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the comprehensive yet informal study of the Encyclopedia Sciences. Hegel wrote them. This is a
Huh.
Hegel study of sorts. We're on the logic, the first part of the Encyclopedia Sciences. Last time we were on section 5. Um, and now we're on section 6 today. They're not labeled. So if you want to know what they're about, you actually got to read them. But that's okay because this is a comprehensive study, so we're going through all of this. Last time we were talking a lot about uh, natural consciousness experience with philosophy, um, and how uh, you can do philosophy rigorously despite what natural consciousness may initially conceive of as philosophy, as mainly just like opinion throwing or meaningless speculation, lots of these like accusations, right? And we were saying last time today, sometimes we still see these around today, but Hegel saying no, there is an alternative. It can be a rigorous science, but you need to do it correctly if you want to do it. And he compares it, as you can see here, to making a shoe. Just like making a shoe, you need to learn and practice how to do it. You need to do the same thing with philosophy. So that's where we left off last time, and we're picking up here with section 6. Um, so I will open the floor now to any other preliminary introductions or comments, and then we can get going. If there's nothing, does anyone want to read the beginning of section 6?
Sure.
Cool.
It is equally important, on the other hand, that philosophy should be quite clear about the fact that its content,
Oh, I
other
think you
than the
cut out there.
basic
Oh, there you go.
import that is and produces itself in the domain of the
The living
living
spirit.
spirit.
Yeah.
The content, the content that is made into the world, the outer and inner world of consciousness. In other words, the content of philosophy is actuality. The first consciousness of this content is called experience. Within the broad realm of outer and inner there-ness, a judicious consideration of the world already distinguishes that which is only appearance, transient and insignificant, from what truly and in itself merits the name of actuality. Since philosophy is distinguished only in the form from other ways of becoming conscious of the same identical import, its accord with actuality and experience is necessary. Indeed, this accord can be viewed as an outward touchstone, at least for the truth of a philosophy, just as it has to be seen as the supreme and ultimate purpose of science to bring about the reconciliation of the reason that is consciousness of itself with the reason that is, or actuality, through the cognition of this accord.
Cool. Thank you, Harrison. We can break this down a bit. So after saying that philosophy, kind of like a shoe, making a shoe, you need to do it right and do it well, and taking into consideration its history and techniques and methods. It is also important to be clear about the fact that the content of philosophy, nothing other, uh, is nothing other really, or it's often regarded as thoughts and concepts. Uh, but oh wait, I went back a page. Whoops. The content is made into the world, the outer and inner world of consciousness. In other words, the content of philosophy is actuality. So it's philosophy isn't merely just talking about like abstract notions, right? And abstract things. It's also the outer, and what becomes actual. Um, the first consciousness of this content is called experience. So the first uh, contact we come into actuality is experience, which for people who are informed in the history of philosophy know that this philosophers got lots of mileage out of this, especially in the empiricist school of philosophy. They put a big emphasis on this. However, important to note for Hegel, just because the consciousness first does something definitely does not mean it's the only thing. So Hegel's not advocating solely empiricism here, although he is saying it's definitely an important stage of consciousness. Um, and then within the realm of outer and inner there-ness, a judicious consideration of the world art distinguishes that which is only appearance. So he compares appearance to actuality. Since philosophy is only always becoming conscious of the same identical import, it's accord with actuality and experience. So I think he's saying here to avoid having merely appearance, we need to uh, check what comes to consciousness maybe as appearance with
When he says
experience.
a judicious consideration already distinguishes that which is merely consideration, he's talking about a judicious consideration already, meaning before philosophy, I think. So, in other words, natural consciousness, even before philosophy, if it is judicious, that is, if it is, the consciousness of a person with practical wisdom, more or less, a person who is, smart, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, distinguishes appearance from reality,
Actuality, yeah.
right? Distinguishes appearance from actuality. In other words, just to take a very basic example, a judicious consciousness that is natural already distinguishes the appearance that the moon is smaller than the palm of my head from the reality, right? That the palm that is much larger. It's a distance away. That's a very simple example. He's just saying that this distinction between appearance and reality already exists in natural consciousness.
Hmm. Yep. This accord can be viewed as an outward touchstone at least for the truth of philosophy, just as is to be seen of the supreme ultimate purpose of science to bring about the reconciliation of the reason that is conscious of itself with the reason that is, or actuality, through the cognition of this accord. Yeah, so basically, right, we check appearances with actuality, and that is, it's a touchstone for the truth of philosophy. So it's an important aspect of philosophy that is foundational. Right, this judicious consideration of the world is very important for philosophy. That seems to be the gist of this paragraph. Does anyone want to start reading the next section if no one has any other comments on this part?
Sure, I'll go.
Thanks.
In the preface to my Philosophy of Right, the following propositions will be found. What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. These simple propositions have seemed shocking, and they have been attacked, even by those who are not ready to renounce the possession of philosophy, and certainly not that of religion. In the present context, we do not need to discuss religion, since the doctrines of the divine governance of the world express these propositions quite definitely. But as far as their philosophical meaning is concerned, we have to presuppose that the reader has enough education to know, not just that God is actual, but that he is what is most actual, that he alone is genuinely actual, but also, with regard to the formal aspect, that quite generally, what is there partly experience and only partly actuality. Sorry. Huh? But he
What
has
is
to
there is
know
partly
with regard
appearance
to
and what only partly actuality.
what is where.
What is there is
What do you mean? What is there? Like there is a pronoun. What's the noun referring to?
that is what is
I think God.
No,
no.
because we just said that God alone is genuinely actual.
Mhm.
With regard to the
Does he just
formal,
mean in general, like in general, like existence?
Like man,
what
is he talking about like man
appears?
in the sky God?
Yeah, maybe he's talking about there as in terms of appearance, right?
Yeah,
What
I
is
think.
the
Yeah,
okay?
like what comes before us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a confusing sentence. Okay, sure. What is there is partly appearance and only partly actuality. In common life, people may happen to call every brainwave, error, evil, and such like actual, as well as every existence, however wilted or transient it may be. But even our ordinary feeling, contingent experience, does not deserve to be called something actual in the emphatic sense of the word. What contingently exists has no greater value than that which something possible has. It is an existence which just as well, although it is, just as well not be, can just as well not be. I see. When I speak of actuality, one should, of course, think about the sense in which I use the expression, given the fact that I dealt with actuality too in a quite elaborate logic. And I distinguish it quite clearly and directly, not just from what is contingent, even though it has existence too, but also more precisely from being there, from existence, and from other determinations.
There's a footnote. I wonder if we should. Oh, never mind. Can't see those. Okay. I
Okay,
have to go back
wow.
for that. Yeah, that's a
There's,
big.
well, not only is it big, it's loaded.
That's what I mean. Yeah, it's like in terms of content, it's big. Like
Like,
there's lots of
this is
content to
a
unpack.
big deal.
Yeah.
um, okay. So what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. Let's break that down again and just stop as we go. These simple propositions have seemed shocking to many, and they've been attacked even by those who are not ready to renounce the possession of philosophy, and certainly not that of religion. We're going to see why he brings up religion. This I feel confident in explaining.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in the present context, we do not need to discuss religion, since the doctrines of the divine governance of the world express these propositions quite definitely. So, this simply comes from the idea that if we're talking about God, religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
God is a rational being, right? God is the most rational being.
Mm-hmm.
God orders the universe, therefore, according to divine providence, um, because that would be the good thing to do by definition. And so, analytically, if you have the idea of God, it's already contained. The idea that the rational is actual and that the actual is rational is already contained, because what is actual is exactly what God wills, and what God wills will always be rational. So it's very simple. Yes, it's a very simple proposition, that the rational is actual and the actual is rational. Uh, if you are a theist and not a divine command theorist, because divine command theory is uh, not theism in the classical sense.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't know what divine command theory is, don't worry about it. That's just the caveat that I would have for that. Anyway, moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Where were we?
But as far as
Oh, yes, but as far as their philosophical meaning is concerned, we have to presuppose that the reader has enough education to know not just that God is actual, but that he is what is most actual, that he alone is genuinely actual. Um, I wonder why he would have distinguished this from religion, honestly, in this
yeah,
sense.
I don't. Uh, I don't know. Maybe this. He seems to be. Um, what's the word? Like doing this exposition in the context of like who is educated and what, and maybe this part is. I mean, even though like
Yeah, I mean, if
content
you were a
what.
theistic philosopher, of course you would have this idea that God is
Right.
alone genuinely actual.
But if you're just a theologian, then maybe this is something. I mean, it may be implicitly, but I don't know if it's explicitly like you know taught
Possibly.
or something. I don't know. Yeah,
Possibly.
I don't know what the theologians in like the 1820s and 30s were up to, but
But yeah, I don't know that he can barely presuppose this actually, because Kant himself doesn't even know that God is actual. And if you have to assume that your reader is more educated on German idealism than Immanuel goddamn Kant,
Mhm.
you're assuming too much. right? He's clearly assuming like too much here, I think, because he's saying that the reader already has to know what he's, I think, setting out to prove, right?
Mm.
Because um, Kant tries to demonstrate that you cannot have direct knowledge of the thing in itself. And isn't it the task of Hegel right here to prove that we can have no, either that there, not that we should have knowledge of the thing in itself so much as absolute knowledge, right?
Hmm.
Is it not the task of Hegel to suppose that we can have absolute knowledge? And without having absolute knowledge, no one's going to be able to say that we know that God is actual or that God is what is most actual. So it seems to me like
Um,
he's.
uh, this could be because this is post phenomenology. He's written phenomenology. He's like, so the absolute knowledge, absolute knowing section is finished, and presumably he's been taught that the encyclopedias, they're written for like his courses he delivered, I believe, at the University of Vienna and Jena, however you say it. And I'm pretty sure that the students were familiar with his, at least if they didn't directly read phenomenology, they were being taught the content of
Ah,
phenomenology in the lectures.
okay, I see.
So they might be familiar with the notion of like absolute knowing and or I mean, honestly, I don't know. Is this I could be wrong or like looking into this incorrectly, but is this not like something Spinoza would say?
Spinoza would say that this is true, yes, but he wouldn't presuppose it from the reader.
Well, has enough education to know. So you're saying that like I thought this
Well,
was the
but
what
I
this
would
is
assume
talking
that
about.
a reader might very well think that Hume or Kant has offered sufficient objections to Spinoza to undermine his theory.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it's not like a principle that is innovative. If that's what he's trying to say, simply that this is not an innovative claim. Yes, of course it isn't. What he's claiming here is basically the PSR, right?
Mm-hmm.
For for everything which actually exists, there is a cause, right? The principle of sufficient reason. And
Mm-hmm.
this is the guiding philosophy of, Cartesian philosophy and Spinoza's philosophy, Leibniz, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rationalists tend to believe pretty firmly in the principle of sufficient reason. And so he's sort of, it's not innovative at all to say that what is rational is actual and what is actual is rational.
Mm-hmm.
It's a correlate, if not exactly identical, to the idea of everything which exists has a certain determinate cause. But
Mm-hmm.
that's a controversial position at this stage.
Well, that's what he
So,
says. He says that it seems shocking
well,
to
he says
many, and
it
they've been
seems
attacked.
shocking, as if to imply that it shouldn't have been.
Yeah. Well,
Maybe not shocking. Maybe shocking would be the wrong
it's a little
word.
dramatic, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that's fair. You shouldn't be shocked to hear that statement, but it should require defense.
Yeah.
Or so it seems.
Yeah. Well.
Anyway, um let's continue.
Yeah.
Uh okay.
Uh.
But also
Yeah.
with regard to the formal aspect, that quite generally what is there is partly appearance and only partly actuality. Okay, so in other words, what appears for consciousness is part appearance and part actuality.
Well, this is part of the
Basically,
presupposition, right? Not only that
yeah,
God is the most actual, but also there is partly appearance and partly actuality.
right. Well, that are it's simply the idea that what appears to us is conception. Like what is there for consciousness is just like
Mm-hmm.
um, not a complete concept, not complete conceptually,
Yeah. Not
not
completely
absolutely
actual.
true,
Yeah.
not absolutely true.
Yeah.
In common life, people may happen to call every brainwave, error, evil, and such life actual, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this again is going all the way back to he's using those examples specifically. I don't know about brainwave, but error and evil, right?
Mm-hmm.
are supposed to not have any existence in philosophy, going all the way back effectively to Plato. Certainly in medieval philosophy, there's this idea that error and evil do not actually exist, but are relative things that exist from the human perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but as for every existence, however, as well as for every existence, however wilted and transient it may be. But even our ordinary feeling, a contingent existence, does not deserve to be called something actual in the emphatic sense of the word. What contingently exists has no greater value than that which something possible has. It has an existence, which, although it is, just as well could not be. Well, this is the assumption that actuality is tied to being
Yeah,
necessarily actual.
necessity. Yep.
So, in order to be fully actual, the
It
idea is
needs to
that
be
something needs to
necessary.
be necessarily actual,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the only way to be necessary is, of course, through logical necessity, right? Which is to be rational.
Mm-hmm.
So, it would follow from the idea that um, you need necessary existence to have actuality in the fullest sense. Um, but uh, this doesn't seem to, again, accord necessarily with the way people think of the word actual.
Yeah,
But
this
when I
is this is his own like definition that he's setting out right here. I think.
right, but when I speak of actuality, one should, of course, think about the sense in which I use the expression, given the fact that I dealt with actuality too in a quite elaborate logic, and I distinguished it quite. You need to move forward.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was reading something.
Clearly and directly, not just from that which is contingent, even though it has existence too, but also more precisely from being there. So that was the there we were talking about
Mm-hmm.
earlier, I think. From existence and from other determinations. Okay, sure, but we don't have that book here. So what can we do? Do we need to go back here to understand this book? Because that's an important premise. What's the footnote say? Or it's an
I
end
can't
note.
I can't see it. I can
It's
look.
an end note.
I can look right. Yeah. I can grab my copy and read it if we'd like, but
I
um,
mean, this seems like a major issue, right?
yeah.
Because he's relying on like this is a foundational principle.
Mm-hmm.
The actual is the rational, and the rational is the actual.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, I mean it in a very particular sense, which I've already established in this other book.
Hmm. Oh yeah, in logic, yeah. I distinguish it quite clearly and distinctly from being there from other determinations. Um. Well, I think he elaborates on what is, or I think he gives us a hint as to what's there. When he's talking about here, it is an existence which, although it is, can just as well not be. Uh, so I think that's kind of what he means when he says like being
So, I
being
mean, I
there.
guess we could take the actual to mean what is necessarily actual. But the problem with this is, of course, it doesn't tell us much, does it? Right? If we
No.
go back, all he's told us in this say like phrase here is that the actual has to be necessary, right?
Mm.
But if I said what is rational is or what is rational is actual necessarily, and what is actually necessary or necessarily actual is rational,
Mm.
that statement would seem to be less controversial. No, like
Yeah.
national or like no one seems to deny that necessity is rational.
Hmm.
But
I'm
it doesn't seem like what would be meaningful content is just asserting that what is necessary is rational, but rather that like something about our actual experience is necessarily rational.
Yeah, it seems to be what he's saying. I can grab my copy real quick and look at the footnote.
Yeah,
Uh,
that seems
so,
good.
or the end note, rather. So let's see here. Number 4. Oh, see specifically Science of Logic, Book 2, Part 3, Chapter 2. Okay. I have the Science of Logic in here. I will grab it. Alright, I got my copy of Science of Logic. Book 2, Part 3, Chapter 2. Okay. Where's the table of contents in this thing? It's past the translators. Okay. So, Book 2. The Doctrine of Essence. Part 3, Chapter 2. Oh, actuality. Okay. Page 477. Well, I do indeed see many things about contingency and actuality. Well, what's here is contingency, formal actuality, possibility, and necessity. These are the things that he tackles in this. The problem is it says to see the whole chapter, so
A chapter of the logic.
Yeah, that's what this number 4, this end note, it just tells me to see like the chapter of the third part of the second book, which is actuality, and but the chapter is very long.
Ah.
So
Yeah, so this seems to be a problem for us.
this was yeah. So when I was excited to start this, but I was afraid something like this would come up, where to be honest, it shocks me that this is happening with the logic, the science of logic. I thought this was going to happen with like something of a Kantian work. I thought this was going to happen to either a part of the critique, which we didn't get to yet in Kant study, in the first critique study, or I thought it was going to be in like one of the other Kantian critiques, or I thought it was going to be some like other work. I didn't know this was going to come up on freaking section, what are we on, 6, and have us reference the big logic, because this book is made for students of his classes who like presumably haven't, like, the reason he made this was to understand the logic, at least according to the historians of philosophy that I've read. So
Well, I guess the idea is to read the logic first and then this.
that's just confusing to me, though, because this was made to help understand the logic.
Well, maybe you're supposed to read the logic,
Get
and not
confused and then
understand
read
it.
this.
I guess so.
All right. uh. So what's the move here?
The move is to read the next paragraph, and we'll see where we go from there.
Okay, I had a similar thing in mind, so let's. I'm the only one who hasn't read that, so I'll read this thing, see if it clears anything up, and we will have a discussion on the course of this. We may have to put a pause on this study for a good while, unfortunately. Again, I didn't think this was going to be a problem because, according to the things I had read, this was to prepare
But
for studies of Hegel's system, which is most rigorously outlined in the Science of Logic. So I'm shocked that he references the Science of Logic in
it
here
says that
for.
I have provided the definition you need in the science of logic.
And there is no real clear-cut definition. There's a whole chapter like this. It's telling you right here on this endnote to read an entire chapter of the middle of the book, by the way. So which is like hundreds of pages in. So I am very shocked at this occurrence. Anyway, just in case anyone was confused as to why we were confused as to what's happening. But let's read this next paragraph and see what happens. So, the notion that ideas and ideals are nothing but chimeras, and that philosophy is a system of pure phantasms, sets itself at once against the actuality of what is rational. But, conversely, the notion that ideas and ideals are something far too excellent to have actuality, or equally something too impotent to achieve actuality, is opposed to it as well. However, the severing of actuality from the idea is particularly dear to the understanding, which regards its dreams, i.e., its abstractions, as something genuine, and is puffed up about the ought that it likes to prescribe, especially in the political field, as if the world had to wait for it in order to learn how it ought to be, but is not. If the world were the way it ought to be, what then would become of the pedantic wisdom of the understandings ought to be? When the understanding turns against trivial, external, and perishable objects, institutions, situations, etc., with its ought, objects that may have a great relative importance for a certain time, and for particular circles, it may very well be in the right, and in such cases it may find much that does not correspond to correct universal determinations. Who is not smart enough to be able to see around him quite a lot that it is not, in fact, how it ought to be? But this smartness is wrong when it has the illusion that, in its dealings with the objects of this kind and with their ought, it is operating within the true concerns of philosophical science. This science deals only with the idea, which is not so impotent that it merely ought to be and is not actual, and further, with an actuality of which those objects, institutions, and situations are only the superficial outer rind. So, to me, the gist of this paragraph is distinguishing between ought to be and actual, and it seems to be defending philosophy against the criticism of ought to beers, so to speak. That is, people who think that the world ought to be a certain way, and that is the only viable way of thinking about things, right? How things ought to be, and that is really maybe where like the truth lies in how things ought to be. But Hegel is saying no. That's not what philosophical science is. The science only deals with the idea, and that's not so impotent merely ought to be. It's actually actual. The idea is actualized in reality because philosophy is dealing with the rational, which is actual, and not just merely what ought to be. Ought to be for Hegel, at least in the context of like the ought to be that's laid out here. This is kind of empty because it's not actual. And what actual is, although we may have a vague idea, we may need to delve into the middle of the science of logic to fully grasp. But at least this kind of gives you maybe a clearer picture of what it is through its negation, right? Ought to be. So it's not this, right? It's something that is actualized in the world, not only abstractly, but even in something as concrete as politics. So that seems to me will be what's going on here. Do we have any other analyses or comments or questions?
Uh, Yeah, I guess he's saying that the origin of the idea that there's a divorce between what is rational and what is actual lies in this wishing the world that were some way other than it is.
Yeah, which to me also seems to have an implication of like necessity, right? Because what is actual is rational. We were talking earlier how that very well could involve necessity and probably does, although we'll have to, as this end note keeps reminding us, we'll have to read Science of Logic to be sure. But if that is the case, then it seems ought to be is maybe like a contingent thing, and people think it's necessity, but what is actually necessity is the actual idea. Hopefully that makes some sense. I don't know. I don't know if that connects to what you were saying, but yeah, the divorce between the idea and the actuality does seem to be this notion of ought to be,
Mm-hmm.
um, which doesn't have as much weight for Hegel because the idea is actualized. So we'll have to learn more about actuality to truly understand what that means, more deeply understand what that means anyway. Um, so that turns the conversation back to what is the move here? um,
Yeah.
do we want to pause this and do a science of logic study? uh,
Well, why don't we talk about that off camera?
okay. Um, yeah. So we don't really know where we're going yet, and you probably don't either. I know at some point, God willing, time willing, we will continue the study, but that remains TBA. So hold your horses, and in the next Hegel study, whether that's of science of logic or of this or something else, hopefully we will have an update for you as to what our plan is for this. So stay tuned, and thank you for joining us. And eventually we'll get to section 7, whether that's soon or later. Uh, Remains to be determined. So hopefully we'll all find out soon. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in whatever lies next. Sayonara. Don't forget to be actual, whatever that means. Gang doesn't fuck with ought to be. Alright, see.